Imagine sitting in your living room in the hot summer of 1862. The air is thick, stifling, and heavy with the overpowering scent of blooming lilies. But those flowers aren't there for decoration. They are trying and failing to cover up the smell of your dead loved one sitting just 3 feet away from you. Before modern funeral homes, you didn't send a body away to a morgue. You kept them right where you drank your morning coffee. But in the middle of a scorching July, nature moves fast. Enter one of the strangest, most macabre inventions in American history, the corpse cooler, a zinc-lined, ice-packed casket designed to freeze a body just enough so the family could stare into their dead relative's eyes for 3 straight days without the horror of rotting flesh ruining the wake. Tonight, we are opening the vault on Victorian America's darkest secret, how a box of river ice, a few zinc plates, and a terror of being buried alive created the modern American death industry. Stick around, because what happened inside these parlors was far crazier than any horror movie. To understand why anyone would put a corpse in a refrigerator in their living room, you have to realize one fundamental truth. In 1860s America, death wasn't handled behind closed doors in a pristine, sterile hospital. Death was a family affair. Most Americans were born at home and they died at home. When someone passed away, whether from tuberculosis, cholera, or a fever, the clock started ticking immediately. But Victorian society had strict, unyielding rules about mourning. You couldn't just bury someone the next morning. You had to hold a wake. Friends, family, and neighbors had to travel miles by horse and buggy to pay their final respects. A proper wake lasted anywhere from 2 to 4 days. Now picture doing that in August in Philadelphia, Chicago, or Richmond without air conditioning, without modern chemical embalming, and without electricity. Within 24 hours, nature would take its course. The skin would discolor, gases would build up, and the smell would consume the entire house. For centuries, people used simple tricks. They washed the body in vinegar, placed bowls of camphor under the bed, and stacked the room with suffocating amounts of flowers. But during a warm spell, vinegar couldn't stop physics. In the early 1800s, cabinet makers, who were often hired to build coffins, realized they had a massive business problem on their hands. If a body decomposed too fast, the family panicked, the wake was ruined, and the community was traumatized. They needed a way to buy time, and the answer came from an industry you'd least expect, the great American ice trade. In the mid-19th century, America was obsessed with ice. Ice barons were cutting massive blocks of natural ice from frozen lakes in Massachusetts and shipping them down south and all across the country in insulated ships. It didn't take long for inventors to look at a block of ice keeping butter fresh and think, why not do that with Grandpa? The earliest official attempt to turn death into a cold storage operation came in 1846, when inventors Robert Fredwick and George Trump filed a U.S. patent for what they called a refrigerator for corpses. Their design was straightforward, brutal, but effective. It was a wooden box with a metal wedge placed directly over the chest and stomach of the deceased. The box was filled with cracked ice, keeping the core body temperature frozen, while leaving the face exposed so people could still look at the deceased during the wake. By 1862, right in the bloody heat of the American Civil War, these designs were perfected and became universally known as corpse coolers or corpse preservers.
The 1862 corpse cooler was essentially a heavy oval or rectangular wooden box, often made of mahogany or oak, lined completely with sheet zinc or tin. Inside, it was split into compartments. There was an upper ice trough, a tray at the top or sides that held 50 to 100 pounds of crushed ice. As heavy, cold air naturally sank down from the ice tray, it circulated over the body to freeze the soft tissue. Then came the drainage system. As the ice melted over 48 hours, the freezing water flowed through hidden tubes down into a bucket tucked quietly under the coffin table. If you were attending a wake in 1862, you would hear the solemn, hushed tones of grieving relatives, accompanied by the persistent drip, drip, drip of melted river ice draining into an iron bucket under the corpse. Undertakers didn't leave these coolers at your house permanently. They were rented out. An undertaker would roll up to your front door on a wagon, lug this heavy zinc-lined box into your parlor, dump 75 pounds of lake ice inside, place your deceased relative into it, and tell you that you had 72 hours to make it count. Now, hosting a wake with a corpse cooler created a whole subculture of bizarre Victorian superstitions and rituals. When someone died in the house, the family immediately went to work. First, they stopped every clock in the house at the exact minute of death. Some believed it paid respect to the dead. Others feared that if time kept moving, another family member would die soon after. Next, they draped every mirror in the parlor with thick black crepe paper or velvet cloth. Victorians believed that a mirror was a doorway to the spirit world. If a dead person's reflection was caught in a mirror, their soul would be trapped inside the glass, or worse, the spirit would look back into the house and summon someone else to follow them to the grave. Then came the placement of the corpse cooler. Because the cooler kept the body cold, it preserved facial features remarkably well. This opened the door for one of the most famous and eerie trends of 19th century America, post-mortem photography. In the 1860s, photography was expensive. Most working-class Americans never had a single photo taken of themselves while they were alive. When a child or parent died, the wake was the only chance the family had to capture their image forever. Thanks to the corpse cooler keeping the body firm and cold, photographers could prop the deceased up, dress them in their finest clothes, stand them against wooden supports, and pose them with living family members. If you look closely at many 1860s post-mortem photos, the dead relative often looks remarkably calm, almost sleeping. That wasn't luck. That was the work of dozens of pounds of ice packed beneath their back inside an undertaker's cooling board. As ingenious as the corpse cooler was for 1862, it was far from foolproof. In fact, relying on ice to preserve a dead body created absolute nightmares when things went wrong. First off, you were entirely dependent on the iceman. If an ice delivery was delayed during a heat wave, the parlor became a race against time. If the ice melted too fast, the undertaker's drainage bucket under the table would overflow. Imagine being a guest at a formal Victorian wake, paying your respects, and feeling cold, blood-stained melted ice water soaking into your shoes through the parlor carpet. Second, there was the issue of thawing. When a body was taken out of a corpse cooler to be placed into a permanent wooden casket for burial, the sudden shift in temperature caused rapid condensation. The body would literally start sweating in front of the horrified mourners. Even worse, as muscles thawed, rigor mortis would release suddenly.
There are historical newspaper accounts of the late 1800s of corpses suddenly shifting, sitting up slightly, or releasing trapped air from their lungs with a gasp right in the middle of a funeral service. Can you imagine being in a dark, candlelit room in 1862, sitting next to a zinc icebox and hearing the corpse inside make a groaning sound because trapped air expanded as the ice melted? People lost their minds. They thought the dead were coming back to life. In the 19th century, medical science wasn't what it is today. Doctors didn't have heart monitors or brain scans. They relied on checking a weak pulse or holding a mirror to someone's mouth to look for breath. During outbreaks of diseases like cholera, yellow fever, or severe cataleptic trances, people would fall into comas so deep that their heartbeat became virtually undetectable and their skin turned ice cold. Doctors would officially declare them dead. The family would rent a corpse cooler, pack the person in ice, and prepare for the wake. There are documented cases where people suffering from catalepsy were put into corpse coolers only for the shock of freezing ice water against their skin to wake them up from their coma. Imagine waking up, completely paralyzed by cold, locked inside a dark metal-lined box, packed with ice, looking up through a small glass viewing window at your family crying over you. This horrific fear was so widespread in America that inventors began patenting safety coffins alongside corpse coolers. In 1862 and the years following, dozens of patents were filed for coffins equipped with air pipes, ladders inside the vault, and strings tied to the hands of the corpse connected to a brass bell above ground. If you woke up 6 feet under, you would pull the string, ring the bell, and hope the night watchman heard you. That's actually where the popular phrases "saved by the bell" and "dead ringer" originated. The corpse cooler became a weird double-edged sword. It preserved the dead, but it also served as the final brutal test to see if someone was really dead. If you survived 2 days packed in ice inside an undertaker's cooler, you were officially gone. So whatever happened to these bizarre 1862 ice boxes? Why don't we use zinc corpse coolers today? The answer comes down to 2 things: the American Civil War and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Between 1861 and 1865, over 600,000 American soldiers died on battlefields hundreds of miles away from their homes. Families in the North desperately wanted the bodies of their sons, brothers, and husbands shipped back home for a proper burial. You couldn't ship a body on a train from Virginia to Massachusetts using just a bucket of ice. The ice would melt in hours, leaving a rotten disaster inside the train cars. An American military doctor named Dr. Thomas Holmes saw an opportunity. He perfected a chemical technique called arterial embalming. By pumping toxic chemical fluids, often filled with arsenic and formaldehyde, directly into the vascular system, he could preserve a body internally without needing a single pound of ice. At first, everyday Americans were horrified by the idea of pumping chemicals into their dead relatives. They preferred the natural traditional method of the corpse cooler, until April 1965. When President Lincoln was assassinated, his body was embalmed using Dr. Holmes's methods and placed on a funeral train that traveled 1,600 miles across the United States, stopping in major cities so millions of Americans could see his face. For 3 weeks, Lincoln's body stayed perfectly preserved in the open air without ice. The American public was stunned. Almost overnight, chemical embalming became the symbol of status, respect, and modern science. By the late 1880s, the ice-filled corpse cooler was pushed out of the parlor. Funeral directors stopped lugging ice boxes into family homes and started building dedicated funeral homes equipped with chemical embalming rooms and modern mechanical refrigeration. Today, the 1862 corpse cooler is nothing more than a forgotten relic buried in patent archives and dark museum basements. But its footprint is still all around us. Have you ever wondered why we call the main room in our house a living room? In the 1800s, that room was officially called the parlor, the room reserved specifically for death, wakes, and corpse coolers. In the early 20th century, as death was moved out of the house and into professional funeral homes, interior design magazines literally advised Americans that the parlor was no longer for the dead, and to rename it the living room. The next time you walk through your front room, imagine the flickering candlelight, the smell of heavy lilies, the black draped mirrors, and the quiet sound of ice dripping into a bucket beneath an iron box. That was how America said goodbye in 1862. If you enjoyed this deep dive into America's darkest historical secrets, smash that like button and hit subscribe to join our journey through history's forgotten archives. Drop a comment below. Would you ever allow a 19th century wake in your living room? Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.